It's particularly important for tribal communities to participate in Wisconsin's judicial elections because, these justices make decisions impacting our sovereignty rights, impacting the welfare of our children, impacting the well-being of our environment and our natural resources. And those justices need to understand that we're a part of their constituency, and that's why our votes matter so much in these elections. I'm Allison Neswood. I'm a senior attorney at the Native American Rights Fund. I am a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I'm really glad to be here with you today. Judicial elections are really important for Native communities, and in that they impact a lot of issues that are really important to Native people. But taking a step back, laws are set out in the federal and state constitution and in statutes, but it's typically judges that decide what those laws mean and how they will apply to certain situations when the laws themselves are open to different interpretations. So this means that judges are deciding what our rights are. They're deciding what our rights to healthcare are, what our voting rights are, what our rights in the criminal justice and family law contexts are. For Native people specifically, judges' decisions impact the power of tribal governments and tribal courts. All of these things are immensely important for tribal communities, and Wisconsin judges should know that Native people are part of their constituency, and that's the power of voting in these elections. In an important set of cases referred to as the Teague Trilogy, the Wisconsin Supreme Court set out a framework for what state courts need to do when a tribal court may have jurisdiction over a case. And so jurisdiction essentially means just a court's authority to decide a case. And sometimes both state courts and tribal courts will have jurisdiction over the same issue. Under the Wisconsin Supreme Court's Teague cases, Wisconsin courts are required to consult with tribal courts to determine the tribal court's jurisdiction and to transfer cases to tribal court when appropriate. In less than a decade after the adoption of this framework, Wisconsin state courts transferred over 1,400 cases to the Oneida Tribal Court as an example of that framework's effectiveness. That's more issues involving tribal members and tribal property and tribal interests being decided by their own tribal courts according to their own laws and values. And this is just such a crucial outcome for tribal sovereignty. So those Teague cases were from the early 2000s, but there are examples of important Indian law issues making their way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court from as recently as right now. In a case called Legend Lake Property Owners Association versus Kashina, a private property association filed a lawsuit basically asserting a right to use portions of land that had been taken into trust for the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin. The tribe was ultimately able to get the lower Wisconsin court to dismiss the property association's lawsuit as basically contrary to their land and sovereignty rights as a tribal nation. So this important tribal land rights case is set to come down to a decision by the Wisconsin Supreme Court justices, and this illustrates the importance of the justices understanding and respecting tribal sovereignty rights. In the future, the court is likely to hear Indian Child Welfare Act or ICWA cases. ICWA is a federal law that was passed in 1978 in response to the high number of Native children that were being removed from their families and communities. So before passage of ICWA, studies indicated that between 25 to 35% of Native American children were being removed from their homes by state child welfare agencies. And the large majority, like an estimated 85% of those children, were placed outside their tribal communities in non-Native homes. So the purpose of ICWA is to protect the best interests of Native children by ensuring that Native children who need to be removed from their homes stay with their tribal communities whenever possible. It also works by ensuring that tribal courts, as opposed to state courts, make child welfare and child placement decisions involving Native children as much as possible. But this law is under attack by interests that are seeking to undermine tribal sovereignty for a whole host of reasons. And we're likely to see those attacks play out in federal court, but also in state courts, including in Wisconsin. So it's really important that the judges and the justices on the high court in Wisconsin really understand the foundations of this law and why it's so essential to tribal communities and the upholding of our rights. So it's possible that the Wisconsin Supreme Court will hear cases related to the Indian Child Welfare Act, that they'll hear important environmental matters and matters related to the protection of tribal resources involving the Line 5 oil and gas pipeline. And it's always something to watch to see whether cases involving the protection of voting rights will go through the state court system, and these always have a big impact on our tribal communities as well. On April 7th of this year, there is a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice seat up for election. The candidates to fill the seat are Maria Lazar and Chris Taylor, who are both Court of Appeals judges. One important thing to know about judicial elections in Wisconsin is that they are nonpartisan, which means you will not see a partisan affiliation like Democrat or Republican or Independent next to the candidates' names. Typically, reporting on the candidates will characterize their ideology as either more liberal or more conservative or more Democrat or Republican. But it is an important thing to note that these elections are nonpartisan. A good place to start to see what each candidate stands for is their campaign websites. Of course, these are websites that will paint the candidate in the best light. But it's also where the candidate tells voters who they are and what they believe. Candidates will also usually list what groups or people have endorsed them, so you can see if any of those people or groups are aligned with your values and which judicial candidates they support while you make this consideration. In addition, candidates typically give talks and answer questions at in-person events during their campaigns. If you have the opportunity to attend one of these and ask questions, that's a great way to get to know the candidates. Sometimes there are debates held between the candidates, which are great ways to get to know how the candidates differ on key issues. In addition, in Wisconsin, Supreme Court elections often get a lot of attention, meaning that both local and national newspapers have a lot of stories on the candidates. Established newspapers usually have separate news and opinion sections. Although many papers can have, more liberal or more conservative slant, articles in the news section should typically be more balanced and focused on the facts, while authors of opinion articles are trying to assert a point of view. So often I try to look at both types of coverage in order to make up my own mind. Public news sources like PBS and NPR and their local affiliates are often good sources for balanced coverage. And lastly, some nonprofit organizations are able to take positions on candidates. And so, voters can check out their positions for guidance as they make their determination on who to vote for. As in most places, the state court system in Wisconsin has 3 levels. At the lowest level are the circuit courts. The next level up from the circuit courts is the Court of Appeals. The next level up from the Court of Appeals is the Wisconsin Supreme Court. With limited exceptions, the Supreme Court has discretion as to which cases it will review. The Supreme Court typically only takes cases that involve the most important issues and cases where there is a split in the Court of Appeals. So this is where one appeals court decides an issue one way and another appeals court decides the same issue the opposite way or a different way. So the Supreme Court will come in and resolve that disagreement. So the thing to note here is that the Supreme Court is really only making decisions about the most important issues in the state. So the Supreme Court justices are resolving the core disagreements in the state about what the law is and what our rights are. So as context, there are 261 circuit court judges, 16 Court of Appeals judges, and 7 justices that sit on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And all of these judges and justices are selected by Wisconsin voters. On the first Tuesday of April every year, Wisconsin holds spring elections. And if a judge or justice's term is ending, the voters decide at that spring election who will fill the open seat. Circuit Court judges and Court of Appeals judges are elected to 6-year terms, and Supreme Court justices are elected to 10-year terms. What that means is every time there's a Supreme Court justice up for election, Wisconsinites' votes are so important because they determine who will sit on the state's high court for the next 10 years. As sovereigns, we get to govern our own affairs. That means we can live by laws that reflect our values, that we get to develop our natural resources in alignment with our teachings about the sacredness of the natural world. It means that we can protect our women and children, revitalize our languages, and pass our spiritual practices to future generations. So, at base, tribal sovereignty is about our continued existence as peoples. And that's why we fight so hard to protect it. When Native people express our power at the ballot box, we help ensure that the people elected to office at the federal, state, and local levels are thinking about our rights and the well-being of our communities. So without accountability to Native voters, elected officials can continue to ignore us and harm us, often without consequence. So by voting, we're not only protecting our communities now, we're protecting our communities for generations to come. Vote on Tuesday, April 7th for the Wisconsin Supreme Court election.